This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. My guest today is Columbia linguist and New York Times columnist John McWhorter. In 2021, he published Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America, which argued that politically correct anti-racism was not only a new religion, but a dangerous form of illiberalism that quashed free expression, individual liberty, and social progress. We talk about how far we've come since 2021 and whether we're entering a new era of open debate and cultural possibilities. We also discuss the apparent end of DEI programs and John's own experience with affirmative action over his decades in academia and the public square. And he talks about his forthcoming book, Pronoun Trouble, the story of us in 7 little words, which comes out in April. This conversation was taped in front of a live audience in New York City. Here is the Reason Interview with John McWhorter. I thought we would start, John. In 2021, you published Woke Racism. The subtitle was How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. You argued that politically correct anti-racism was actually an illiberal religion that quashed free expression and social progress. Okay, we live in a world now. You fast forward, you won. Okay, people agree with you. Wokeness is over. Figures such as Ibram X. Kendi, who is one of your kind of white whales, if I can mix metaphors in a bad way, and Robin DiAngelo, they're openly ridiculed now in a way that when you wrote Woke Racism, they were in high esteem. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has removed her pronouns from her Twitter bio. Governments, universities, corporations are disowning DEI. So I guess my first question is wokeness really dead?
No, wokeness is not dead, and I don't think it ever will be if we're talking about a certain punitive stripe of wokeness. But the peak woke of 2020 and 2021, I feel confident in saying now that has passed. That was a different time, and I think that it was caused by a combination of how horrible what happened to George Floyd was, the fact that around the time that happened was when we were realizing that the lockdown was not going to end anytime soon. It was a beautiful spring. Everybody was bored, lonely, and had time to invest themselves in a cause. And I think that's what started the hyper wokeness, and I think that the media of Zoom encouraged it because it took people away from having physical presence with each other. But what there needed to be was a pushback, and I don't think of myself as winning, but I definitely went into a kind of bourbon-fueled rage in the summer of 2020, and I thought, this must stop. I am going to be somebody who's generally regarded as contrarian but sane, and I'm going to write something that I hope people will actually read to make it clear that you can be a good person and understand that something has gone terribly wrong. Other people made the same point. It worked. And I think it was a beautiful example of how you get the conversation going and you can actually create change. So yeah, that time is over. I think most people understand that, DiAngelo and Kendi, there's an old theater term, over-parted, meaning that you would put somebody in a lead role when really they should have been in a subsidiary role. Like if Dinah Shore is in a film musical and she's the star, she's over-parted. It doesn't work. Those two are over-parted. And I think that now we're beginning to think of them as, what they really are. And so here we are. The arts and academia, however, are still ravaged by this frame of mind. I'm beginning not to recognize my own field, frankly. And that's sad, but those are only 2 parts of the world. And I actually am feeling good about most things going on in terms of that particular time. Despite, I'll leave ellipses. Go ahead.
No, what are some of the things that you're feeling good about? And what do you think if the arts and the universities are kind of lagging indicators here? What killed it in these other areas that you're excited about?
I think that the excesses of that time, the defenestrations, the firings, the social shamings, I think reasonable people could see once it became clear that that was an epidemic and not just a few things happening here and there. Reasonable people could see that this was not a proper thing to do. It's harder to make people see that in certain rarefied realms, but I feel good in that, for example, people aren't being fired. People aren't being pushed out of windows. People aren't being shunned the way they were in 20 and 21. I remember in 22 thinking that something had broken when there was Jeffrey Lieberman, who was the head of a department of psychiatry, who made one tacky comment about a black model and his life was ruined in a second. That was barbaric. Next year, a strangely clueless, older, very white chancellor out in the Midwest, it was at Purdue, got up and imitated.
Helen Midwest at Purdue?
Where is Purdue?
Purdue's in the Midwest.
Yeah, so something...
This seems a little made up, to be quite honest.
At Purdue, he's giving a talk, and for some reason he does an imitation accent. He says, "Here's my phony accent," and he did a cartoon Mickey Rooney Chinese accent for like half a second. That character was Japanese, but what he was doing sounded like bad Mandarin, and that was unfortunate. He didn't get fired, and I remember thinking, if this were last year, they would have sent him to the planet Jupiter. And so we are in a different time now.
What accounts? Well, where are the places that you think positive change is happening?
Oh, frankly, you can see it just in the world in general. For example, in the medical establishment, where high wokeness is being pushed back against in a way that it wasn't in 2021. There are school boards that are pushing back against the idea that there are black versus white ways of learning, that writing is for white people and talking is for black people, et cetera. All of that was scaring people into submission in 2021. That's happening less and less now.
In that scheme, where do Italians fit in?
Where do what's fit in?
If writing is for white people and talking is for black people.
I get the feeling they would say that Italians are kind of black in that way. Right. It's just supposed to talk.
So in the arts, I'm curious, after the election, or at some point, I guess it was around Trump's inauguration, Robert Smigel, the very funny writer who created Triumph, the insult comic dog, that has been on a variety of shows and whatnot. He went to an anti-Trump march, and he was kind of joking at the expense of the protesters. And it seems to me that's something that wouldn't have happened, in 2020. Are you confident that the arts, and by that I mean kind of comedy, and TV and movies, are they catching up? Are they shifting? They're not going to become, start doing Barry Goldwater, series or something, but that they're just getting back to a place where they feel comfortable making fun of everything rather than just a few things.
I would hope that that's the case. From what I'm seeing with what are unfortunately called the high arts, it worries me that unfortunately there's a general idea that if you're not committed to battling oppression, then the work that you're creating isn't important. I'm seeing that with classical musicians. I'm seeing that with people who are painters. I'm certainly seeing it in what kind of theater gets done, especially when it's not, say, the theater of Broadway, but theater beyond. Theater companies are closing not just because of the economy and COVID, but because they have a sense that they're supposed to have woke theater, which audiences tend not to like as much as they've been told to.
Do you think that's more common in certain arts that are less market driven? And I don't want to say that whatever succeeds in the market is aesthetically good, but if you have to get people to actually buy tickets as opposed to if you're being funded by mega corporations or a few people.
Exactly. I think, though, also, when you look at film and television, there are wonderful things that came out of some of it. So, for example, there is more diversity of casting that would often have been unheard of even 10 years ago. And that's a response to what was an extremely overheated, punitive, and ridiculous call from a certain fringe of the theater world, I think. But it had a positive outcome in that people listened a bit. And the idea was not that wokeness is wrong, it's that it's not supposed to stand up and be everything. Yeah. And I think that ended up playing out.
Yeah, I always love when people talk about how could James Bond be black or a woman? I mean, as a fictional hero, he is obviously
right,
an English guy who then gets played by a Scottish guy. How dare you?
right,
How
yeah.
dare you play with that?
And, it's at the point where if you say a black James Bond,
Yeah.
I think most of us barely jump. That would not have been true 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing.
Although you would agree that having a woman play M is a bridge too far.
It would be a stretch, but I could put up with it.
Yeah. I guess, in a country like England that had a queen in the 16th century.
Nick, actually, no, that's easier. That's very easy now. Black Captain America. This is gonna sound so snobbish. I've never seen a Marvel movie, but I read about them. And a black Captain
America. You read
America.
about them in the New Yorker.
I do.
Yeah. Okay.
I've been thinking I'd like to see these things.
You've seen several cartoons about Marvel, the Marvel comic universe.
Pretty much it.
Yeah.
I've heard that it's a verse. Yeah, that they're all in one place.
Talk a little bit more about what should we miss about wokeness or political correctness? And I think I agree with you that it isn't gone, but the tide is definitely moving out. But are there things that it accomplished that we should be mindful of?
Yeah, I think that to the extent that there is more of an awareness that racism is not just running up and calling someone a name, that's a good thing. And an awful lot of volume and abuse was required, apparently. But for people to think about those things more does make us a more enlightened society in a way that, for example, Trump over the past 3 weeks is trying to take away. The idea that you think about all of that stuff too much, don't think about it at all. I think that what happened in 2020 and 2021 would have left us in actually a rather good place if it weren't for the extremes that are being modeled by the current administration. So we have to see what's going to happen.
So talk about that, because you wrote a piece at Persuasion, I believe, attacking Trump's anti-DEI executive order. And, explain in that you talked about DEI as institutionalized anti-whiteness. But then in that essay, you talk about how, Bill Clinton, who famously talked about affirmative action back in the 90s, does anybody here remember the 90s? It feels like a different timeline altogether, right? I mean, it's like the Pleistocene,
90s.
The dinosaurs, it was the Flintstones.
The internet barely exists yet.
But Bill Clinton famously said, "Mend it, don't end it," about affirmative action. And you kind of endorsed that. Can you talk about what is the right balance for you?
Here's what's wrong with what's happened over the past 3 weeks, for example. Race-based preferences were a great idea in the 1960s. What should have happened is that there should have been an agreement that it was something that would be done for 20 years.
Although they didn't really exist, right?
In
the 60s. It was
1960
Nixon the term affirmative action, but then Nixon is the one who really kind of pushed racial preferences.
Oddly enough, Arthur Fletcher is the one who was commissioned to do it. And so it becomes a reality in the 70s.
Yeah.
And that made sense because the equation between blackness and poverty was much closer than it is now. I think it was a good experiment. There was fairness, but you can't keep it going until America is perfect and there's no racism and there's no inequality, and even inequality based on race. It lasted too long. So what I've always said is affirmative action is wonderful, but now it should be about socioeconomics. And I think that there's a growing swell of agreement that that's true. I used to say that in 2003 and have watermelons thrown at me. Nowadays, I think it's becoming...
that would be because you are not pro-Palestinian?
Well, then that's a whole other
different kind of
kettle of monkey fish. Kettle of fish.
Yes.
But the thing is...
a kettle of monkeys.
But what's really, I wouldn't mind seeing a kettle of monkeys. What's gone on is lately the idea is no, not even class-based preferences is what some of the Trumpians are pushing, because people would use that to address race through the back door. That's pushing things way too far.
Yeah, and you in that essay at Persuasion, which is easily available, is Google John's name and Trump anti-DEI, say, or something like that. You talk about Trump's anti-DEI executive order, where he says, okay, get rid of all DEI all the time. It's led to the removal in the Defense Department of documentary videos talking about the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. You call that immorality incarnate. Do you remember that?
I do remember writing it.
And can you explain? No, I mean, there's
Although
no
to
reason
tell you
you
the
wouldn't.
truth, it's very easy. It's very easy
Yeah.
to forget your pieces.
Yeah,
like
that's
I
right.
wrote one yesterday.
John, you have no idea how easy it is to forget your pieces.
See, I set myself up for that.
Yeah.
But that one maybe was a little bit less
No.
forgettable. And
But when you say it's immorality
Yeah.
incarnate, what do you mean by
what
that?
I mean by that is that this is a country where the idea that you will give a leg up to a certain group of people because of past and present injustice was actually enforced. We're so used to that at this point that it's easy to forget that that was a pioneering experiment. It's problematic how it was carried out. It held on too long. I don't think there was anything wrong with the Supreme Court's ruling about it in 23. But nevertheless, the basic idea was advanced. And unfortunately, where we are now is that because of the peak wokeness of 5 years ago and how nasty those people were and how afraid people were, I think that Trump is in a position where he can say, not only are we going to not have DEI, as in struggle sessions and the silly corporate trainings, et cetera, but we're just going to get rid of what people like him call stirring that stuff up. I don't think that would have been you may fight me on this one. I don't think that would have been his impulse if there hadn't been the great awakening and its excesses. He wasn't going after affirmative action when he first came in. That's a response to what went on lately, but it's vastly disproportionate. DEI, what most of us think of as DEI, is fine. Getting rid of it is fine. Getting rid of affirmative action, the whole notion of trying to redress injustices and even abstract ones, that's wrong. That's immoral.
Or you mean also a sensitivity to the kind of the recent
sensitivity,
past, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not thinking, I basically am going to pull myself up by my own bootstraps and that's it. My Uncle Max did it. Why can't they?
Yeah.
There's a 2.0 way of thinking.
Yeah.
And that's what Trump and his guys are trying to get away with.
Well, the only people who are more self-made than Trump, of course, are his children. Right? But can I ask from a more libertarian perspective, the question, I don't disagree with you, but also what's the role of the individual in that kind of system? Because the minute that you and this is actually something Michel Foucault talked about when the French, I guess it was in the 17th century or 18th century, started keeping statistics. The state started mandating counts of things. Like just that act of counting created political realities. And when you start thinking about stuff as in group terms, even to redress past offenses against groups, is there any way out of that when you shift off of the individual as the basic unit of society?
My answer to that would be that that's why things like this need to be administered like chemotherapy. If you're going to be addressing people as groups in a way like that, you do it for a short period of time, enough time for there to be effects, but not so that, for example, I think to be a Black individual in America today is often to drink in a tacit sense that we're not supposed to be submitted to serious competition when it comes to academics, when it comes to being evaluated for a job. There's always supposed to be a certain bonus. It's not because of any kind of flaw. It's all you ever knew. For example, I was born in 1965. I've never applied for affirmative action, but all you ever know is that your color is part of why you're being evaluated that way. That should be discouraged. And so what was happening in, say, 1970 should have been called off in about 1990.
Yeah. I mean, could you talk a bit about how does that make you feel? I mean, you are accomplished beyond, my imagination. But, I mean, does that haunt you, the idea that you have, been given an edge, or are you kind of like, no, I don't, and that's why it annoys me? Or, I mean, how do you feel about that experience?
It's hard to give the real answer. It sucks, first of all, because you will never know how good you are. And it gets to the point that anything that you're asked to do, color is a part of it. And you can think to yourself, well, there are worse problems to have, which is true. Yeah. But the truth is it sucks. I don't think about it much, but I look at other Black people who often I see are never required to do things at the highest level and therefore don't know how to and are extremely insulted if somebody implies that they might and it's not their fault. No, it sucks. For me, there is within certain realms, just certain realms. I can't kick a football. I don't know where Purdue is, but when it comes to the stuff that I like doing, frankly, I was born with a certain, people call it confidence. Some people call it arrogance.
Yeah.
But I know
that's what people were calling it earlier.
See?
Yeah.
But so I kind of know. I figure, well,
Yeah.
I did that at about 85%, and I can I'll generate it internally. But no, it sucks. Yeah. I don't know if all Black people know that it sucks, but it sucks.
Are you worried at all about what some people are calling the rise of the woke right, which is a similar focus on kind of public policing of language? An example of this would be, I guess, the Trump administration's renaming of the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. Are you on board with that, or
No.
or does that general kind of gesture worry you?
All of that stuff is 11-year-old boys. It's the sensibility of an 11-year-old boy who's just starting to use deodorant, and he has these unrefined notions that any 11-year-old boy would have. And the idea is that the people who are running our land are supposed to work against spontaneous xenophobia, against jingoism, against giving in to racist or sexist impulses. And we're never going to be perfect. Everything is an eternal rehearsal. But we're supposed to model being something better. And what's going on there is modeling just, it's Miller time. How you feel, just go with it. It is a disgusting thing to see. And when I talked to Glenn Lowry, it's interesting.
Yeah.
We had a problem last year where a great many of the audience were very angry at me. I apparently have Trump derangement syndrome. But there is nothing deranged about reviling what has happened over how many days has it been? 20? It's just been
I stopped counting.
Scary. Yeah. I'm counting. But yeah.
Having said that, you've always defined yourself, I believe, as a kind of centrist liberal. So you believe in a Leviathan state that dictates every aspect of our economic and cultural life, but you also believe in free speech.
Yeah, I wrote a whole book about that Leviathan. Yeah.
My friend Leviathan, me and Leviathan. But you also have called bullshit on excesses of the left, and you're not some kind of crazy socialist. Are you politically homeless right now?
No, because, well, in terms of voting, in terms of what party I belong to, yes. But in terms of feeling alone in my kinds of views, no, because frankly, what's sometimes called the heterodox crowd that has emerged, for example, in this city, especially since about 2017, I think there's a like-minded group of thinkers and writers, and I feel very much at home in that group. And so, no, as a matter of fact, I think that the excesses of wokeness kind of crystallized that group sense of itself as an entity and has helped more people join that sensibility. My sense from a lot of people is what I get from neighbors and family members is, John, I used to think that the things that you were saying were kind of extreme, but lately I'm noticing, and I'm sure that that's true of many people of the way I think. I think there's something coming, but it is certainly politically homeless in terms of what the Democratic Party has become.
Yeah. What for you is the kind of lodestar when it comes to the good society? And when I was writing this question, I was like, can you use lodestars? Can that be plural, or does that mean that you're just going to be sailing around in a circle or something? I don't really know what a lodestar is.
I don't either.
It sounds like a pornographic term, to be quite honest. We have Google Maps now, which say Gulf of America on them. Apparently they cave pretty quickly, but so how do you, what is a good society all about for you? And then maybe we can discuss where you end up ideologically or politically.
There should be equal opportunity. for everyone, with a full understanding that everybody is not going to get to the same place, that there can't be any pretense that everybody is going to get to one particular position, but there should be equal opportunity. There should be a social safety net that keeps people from starving or suffering for a time-limited period during which one is trained for work, but that should be available to anyone who falls upon or is born into hard times. That, to me, and that is one of the better things about the Great Society, which largely did not work. That, to me, is what a society should be. Not a Leviathan, but equal opportunity as much as possible, but with clear eyes.
So does that mean you'll be voting Republican?
No, because there is no Republican Party in the sense that you mean. If I went back in time, I might vote Republican in the 1970s and maybe 80s, but it's hard to go back in time. And the Republican Party right now is not something that I can
I just want to dilate on that for a second. Is there any chance that younger John McWhorter, not to suggest that you're old, but in the mid 80s, that you would have flash forwarded however many years, that's 40 years ago now?
That's 40 years.
Yeah.
When we were
and
at
you would have been
Rutgers.
like, yeah, you know what? I would have voted for Reagan.
See, then I was taught to despise Reagan. And so I did. I didn't think much about politics. There were, always some Republicans down the hall. They were always male, and you always thought of them as a peculiar species. I was definitely that type. And in terms of the militarism, I didn't approve. I didn't approve of his detachment, the fact that he wasn't really running the country and that some of the people under him were rather scary customers. The corporate focus, I didn't like those things. But if I were thinking about how those Republicans were thinking about race as opposed to Democrats at the time, and if I were young me, but I knew some of the things that I learned when I was in my 40s, I maybe would not have been so appalled to see somebody wearing a Reagan t-shirt. This is a little tortured. But I had the experience of eating lunch and dinner every day with a bunch of Republican law school students when I was past 20, for reasons I won't even get into. And I'm always listening to them.
Did you lose a bet?
Talking it was this dormitory plan.
Okay.
And only some of us were on it. And for some reason that I don't now really recall, a disproportionate number of them were very Republican male individuals. And we were all at one table because everybody else was an undergraduate. So I listened to them talking about, Bush, John Tower, etc. every day. And by the end of it, I realized I'm not going to vote like them. I don't agree with their general philosophy, but none of them are fools. And so I tried to be open. But these things get complicated.
You mentioned that you were born in 1965, according to Wikipedia, which is infallible. It's the online encyclopedia everyone can screw up, right? But you have a big birthday coming up later this year. You're turning 60.
Yeah.
Take a moment and I say that you are a young whippersnapper since I've got a couple of years on you. Take a measure of the world that you were born into and grew up in. You have 2 daughters.
Mm-hmm.
And how old are they roughly?
10. I always pantomime it.
Yeah.
10 and 13.
Okay.
I don't know why I do that.
That is very. But talk about the world you grew up in versus the one they're growing up in, and then let's see where you land, and then I'll try and ask a follow-up question.
Race mattered more when I was growing up. It was an interesting time. It wasn't 1960. But it wasn't 1990. There was still a color line socially.
You grew up in
Philadelphia. Very middle class in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But even there, it wasn't hard to be black, but you were black and it did limit you in some things. That is much less true for my daughters. If you were a mixed kid, like my daughters are, their mother is white, you were assumed to have to decide that you were black when you were an adolescent, and in that way disavow one of your parents. Not formally, but you were supposed to be of the classification of your black parent. I watched so many kids in tears about that. And really, that is no longer the case. There's no such thing as biracial in 1975. Now, my daughters are much less concerned with that kind of thing. There's going to be much less of that sort of sense of torture. I don't think either one of them has ever encountered a single kind of even subtle discrimination. And the older one is 13. That's, of course, partly where they live. But still, I wouldn't have been spared it if I had grown up in Jackson Heights in the 1970s. So all of that is better. We're not as classist a country as we were back then. Television is better.
What do you mean by class? We're not as classist?
We work against it. We work against the idea that you look down on people who don't have enough money. Whereas in the very Tony, Quaker, highly Jewish, affluent school that I went to in middle school, people were quite classist, quite openly classist. Sometimes
those
racist.
Quaker Jews.
There were two kinds.
Quite a crowd, right? Yeah. They're very peaceful, but also very.
They were people very richly endowed with traits.
Why do you think that changed? Well, because in a way, we're more attuned to things like status brands now than ever, and why are we less classist than we used to be?
I think that classist in particular. I think that in general, the sense that you view people in hierarchies in that way, that you have a reason to look down on someone for something that they can't control. I think that meme has gotten through in American society, and it's slow, and it's easier to think that change doesn't happen than to allow that it usually happens slowly. But I think that is a way that Americans had come to think. Now, social media happens, and a certain group of people decide to try to push that further and faster and in an extreme way that no one's ever heard of. But before the phones, I think we were getting to a pretty good place. I remember being in a meeting with some professors where we were deciding on who was going to be the dean of something at UC Berkeley in 1998. And race came up. And one guy, white guy, somewhere in his 50s, said, well, yes, I think we've gotten to a point where racism exists, but it's not the defining factor, and we can be thankful for that. His equivalent would not say that today, but I think he was right. We had gotten to that point where people were thinking it exists, and we're going to work against not looking at any black candidates for this deanship, but it's not going to be everything. Now we have a much more distorted kind of discussion, but the peak woke is over.
Do you think with class that has also kind of just disappeared?
It's much less than it used to be. I think of things that my parents, who were educated, were comfortable saying that I would neither say nor feel. Yeah. Like my mother was a brilliant woman. I am her in many ways, but she would very often call somebody, refer to somebody as salt of the earth. Like I learned that term, and it's very articulate. You know exactly what she meant. Isn't she a little salt of the earth? And I don't think that was unusual of people.
And that was a put down.
73. Yeah, the idea being that they're not as good as us. And remember, this is a black person saying it about another black family, but I'm sure that the white version of my mother would have said the same thing. So,
You said television is better.
Oh, well, I was being facetious, but TV's better.
But it is.
Remember what you had was Maude, the $6 million man, and Walter Cronkite? We have gotten way past that. So.
You had me at Maude. Lady Godiva was a freedom rider.
That was one of the best theme songs.
Yeah,
you
didn't have to watch the episode.
First season on DVD, I watched them. They're unwatchable. But that was all. That's all that there was. Walter, the devil will get you for that one. Yeah, God will get you for that one, Walter.
God will get you for that. Yeah. Why do you think TV, not how is it better, but why is it better? What has changed? I mean, in so many ways, I think you're saying we are a much better country than the one that you grew up in. Why is TV better?
If you have to pay for it overtly with the cable model, then there's a reason to make it better. And I think that was part of it. Also, film, talk about the Marvel franchise, as entertaining as I hear these movies are. Film is not as uniformly interesting as it used to be. Talk about the 90s. Remember you went to the movies a lot in the 90s and there were things you wanted to see and every second movie was not Captain America? Movies were good in the 70s,
he was good
80s,
before
and 90s.
He became black. It's like, there goes the neighborhood.
You're saying that because of the past 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But basically, I think that a lot of it is that movies can no longer afford to be special. And so a lot of that creative energy has moved to television. Mm-hmm. If you say today, I don't watch TV, it means that you don't watch things that are the quality of Scorsese and, et cetera. And so I like that. TV is much better these
But
days.
and have we entered a glorious phase of intellectuals where Susan Sontag so famously didn't watch TV? She blurbed a book by Todd Gitlin about TV. It was about primetime TV. And she said her blurb was, this inveterate non-watcher of TV, says bravo to this book.
Mhm.
Have we reached a point now where intellectuals are embarrassed if they don't watch TV?
Frankly, if you're an intellectual and you don't watch what's on television now, you're missing a lot of brilliant fodder for thought. I'm sure Susan Sontag today would be watching a lot of things that are on TV. Severance, for example. Susan Sontag wouldn't find that show stupid. She would
Yeah.
she would get quite a bit out of it, I think. So yeah, we are in that era.
What do you like about Severance? This is an Apple
Oh,
Plus
yeah.
or Apple TV
Yeah.
show that has gotten great reviews.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know where Purdue is. I've never seen
Yeah.
a Marvel movie. I had never heard of Severance until like 10 minutes ago. And then the second season comes. I guess I had heard people saying Severance and I was thinking they were talking about having been fired from a job. I never even heard anybody mention it. But no, the production design of Severance, the contrast between the banal corporate decor and the hideous things that are quietly going on, these banal suits that they wear to work, and yet their lives are being torn apart, the subtlety of the musical scoring, so much of it just has me gripped. And there was literally, every time I watch an episode, I think there was nothing remotely like this on TV in 1980. Rather, you would see something like this, Kubrick would do it at the movies.
Not even when the $6 Million Man teamed up with Sasquatch.
Oh, I thought
Come
you were
on.
going to be the one with the bionic woman.
Yeah, well, that was
that was kind of exciting,
Yeah,
but it
very
was not
and
Severance.
the bionic dog.
And it wasn't The Sopranos. Was there a
Yeah.
dog?
Yeah, there was a bionic dog. Of course.
See, you know that, which means
Oh,
you
yeah.
watched the show.
I watched a lot of TV. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Pronoun Trouble, your forthcoming book. The subtitle is The Story of Us in 7 Little Words. What's the big message of Pronoun Trouble, and who is this for?
It's funny, I don't remember creating that subtitle, but
Yeah.
I accept it. Pronoun Trouble is a book about every pronoun in English. There are stories to tell about me. There's a delicious, frankly, chapter about you, the history of you. And of course, what everybody is going to really want to read is the one about they and
Right.
them. But that's the
I
final.
do just want to point out, since this is a libertarian audience, that Ayn Rand's pronouns were I, me, and mine. But please continue, Professor.
I'm sure she would have loved that.
Yeah.
But they, them. And, the only pronoun that I had trouble getting anything out of was he. He is so boring. So I just had to really dredge for he. But there's everything in it. And I wanted to, one, write about interesting things about pronouns that one might not know. And so, for example, Billy and me went to the store. Nobody 300 years ago would have had any problem with that sentence. The idea that that's wrong is something somebody made up. Oddly, no one's ever really written about it before. No academic linguist, no pop linguist. So I decided to make that case. Then for they, them, you can imagine what that chapter is about. And then with you, it used to be that I would call you thou, and then all of you would be ye. That's how you worked. And you was like a normal language. You had a singular and you had a plural. There used to be a dual you. You used to be able to say, for example, if you wanted to say your, you would say ink, and that meant you twos instead of you alls. It was this beautiful array. Now all we have is you, and there's a whole mystery as to why that happened in the language. So I do Scooby-Doo, and I kind of plumb into it. What happened? These dated references. What happened? And so that's Pronoun Trouble. It's purple, and it's quite readable.
Yeah, you talked about how people have tried to introduce words, manufactured words like Latinx, or Latinx.
Latinx, yeah.
Okay, is one of them. But and you talk about this in the, I worked on Italianx for a while, and I couldn't get anybody to go with me on that.
No, those don't catch on.
You talked about how pronouns, it's really hard to shift them because they're so important, and they evolve slowly, but they're kind of hard to move. But you said that your favorite invented word was sesh for, I guess that was
Heesh.
Heesh. I've got
that was
dyslexia.
that was from the
Yeah.
70s, because
Okay,
get it? It's
but-
like he and she,
Yeah.
heesh. And so the idea was that would be our gender neutral pronoun.
Right. And
But-
why didn't that work?
Because you can't change your pronouns in that way. You can't bring in new ones, or it's very difficult,
Yeah.
especially in a large and diverse society, to say we're going to have this new pronoun that doesn't have any meaning except as a pronoun. That's almost impossible, because pronouns are so deeply seated in our cognition. And so it's great for some people to try for Z and Faye and these other ones, and small circles will be able to get into the habit. But to implant it in society, it'd be cool, but it'll never happen. And so if you need a gender neutral pronoun, you have to use what you've already got. English is kind of pronoun poor. Most normal languages have more pronouns
and it's such
than we have.
a expansive language otherwise.
Yeah,
It's kind
but
of
for
weird,
some
huh?
reason, well, there are reasons, and you can see it in the book.
Okay.
But it means, what are you going to use? They is the only thing that was there. Already it was being used gender neutrally. So tell each student that they can bring their paper in at a certain time.
Right.
So it's a leap. Now, when you say, my girlfriend is in the hospital and they're getting their hair cut, that's tough. We're not used to that, but that's the best it can be, unless we're not going to have a gender neutral pronoun, or unless we're going to say, tell each student that he or she, and that's not the way anybody talks. And so we need a they.
One of the great revelations of the book, and I'm going to spill it here, is that you talked about, I think it was in the chapter on they, that you remembered, of course, as I suspect many people of a certain age will, the Schoolhouse Rock about adverbs. Everybody remembers lolly, getting your adverbs. I will just very briefly, a friend of mine had a bachelor party with a stripper named Lolly, which was a bizarre kind of recitation then of the Schoolhouse Rock. It was a very adverbial,
because you never do meet
party.
an actual person named Lolly. You did,
right?
But I've never.
Yeah, well,
that's true.
I don't know that we met, but we keep in touch. But the secret that you pull out really is there was a Schoolhouse Rock thing on pronouns.
Yeah.
What is it like? I didn't even bother Googling it. But
I was trying to remember what the pronoun one was, because no one cared about that one. And I was just sitting there typing it. And of course, nowadays you just go to YouTube, and I watched it and I thought, I can tell why nobody liked that one. And to be honest, that was 2 years ago and I don't remember it now, but it's something like a pronoun does the work that a noun does or something. And it's set to music, and that doesn't work, but it's actually true. Pronouns replace nouns. I don't know how I would do a song about that either.
in the chapter on they, you talk about you name check your former Berkeley colleague Judith Butler, who your book is Pronoun Trouble. She wrote a book called Gender Trouble, which is very influential. You talk about they is a pretty good way of creating a gender neutral pronoun, but it gets confusing very quickly, and it seems to me you were having fun at her expense. But could you explain a little bit of how they is both good and confusing?
I wasn't trying to make fun of her. She really wants to be referred to as they, and that fits in with, everything that she has put forth about herself over the decades. But there was a very good New Yorker article about her where they were observing that they is what she wants to use. And the truth was, I was, quite open. I was not, trying to bristle. But it got awkward to have to refer to her as they all the time when she's surrounded by pluralities of people who you also refer to as they. Yeah. Sometimes you had to read backwards. And I thought, since the New Yorker is so elegantly written that they work on their prose so much, and that was the best even they could do, I thought sometimes this is unideal. But if we're going to have a gender neutral pronoun, they is the only way. And so there's just going to be a touch of awkwardness in the language. Now, the truth is, time passes, especially lately. When I wrote that in 23, I was assuming that the new they, the gender neutral they, was just going to stick. I thought that was part of the language, and if you don't like it, you're just getting old, get over it. My sense of it over the past about 6 months, maybe it's retreating a little bit from where it had gotten, say, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Maybe it's going to be a sign of the 2000 teens and 2020s. It's too early to predict yet, but I'm sensing that the awkwardness that it can create, and I have tried very hard to embrace it, and I do, maybe there's a bit of a weariness about it. I don't think there's a pushback, but just a weariness.
Is it a young versus old thing as well?
Very much,
or,
yes. In
Can
terms
you
of
explain
its
how
acceptance.
much does that filter into everyday language?
Younger people are very good at using the gender neutral they. They accept it and they use it. My 10 and 13-year-old just jump right into it. Right, 13 and 10. They correct me, when I'm, trying to do it. And then people who you would say are of mature years, people who are graying on the top, etc. People of that age often can't stand it at all. And then people who are in the middle, of which I still consider myself, even though I'm about to be 60, are on the fence or trying, but feel like we're not doing it very well. There have been some surveys about that, which is exactly what you would expect. But it can be hard. We've been using our pronouns one way for decades, and then all of a sudden it seems like instantly. It was like around when The Office went off. It was like just like one night. All of a sudden, there's this they, and you have to use it, and you don't want to hurt people's feelings. It's a challenge, but I've tried to rise to it.
You open the book with a discussion of a classic Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Elmer Fudd cartoon. Could you just explain how that, prompted, or why is that the introduction of the book Pronoun Trouble?
The book is named after a sequence in the Looney Tune of 1953, Rabbit Seasoning, where Bugs Bunny. So if I could pretend that I was naming it after Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, but really I was thinking about Daffy Duck, and they're having this exchange. And how does it go? No, don't shoot him now. Wait till you get him home. Wait, he doesn't have to shoot me now. Shoot me now. Bam. And then Daffy says, hold on. Pronoun trouble. Let's do that again. And they do it again, and he keeps switching the pronouns wrong, and he keeps on getting shot. But that pronoun trouble was what I thought of when the idea for the book came up. I thought this should be named after Daffy Duck's little exchange. And it just felt right. So I opened with that. Rights are such that I could only quote so much. If any more of it, and it would have cost me my house. But that's how it opens.
Do you identify more with Daffy Duck or Bugs Bunny?
I identify with both of them.
This is Tolstoy or Dostoevsky?
Both of them. Both of them very much.
All right. Let me, as a final question, and this will be my final question before we talk a little bit more with the audience. Why is it a good thing? You use everyday pop culture references throughout your work always. That is something that is different from some time in the past. What's good about that, and why should more intellectuals follow your lead in mixing high and low culture?
Because the old division of these cultural tokens into highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow was facile, and a lot of things that people think of as just skitterings about are extremely sophisticated and extremely well done. So, for example, Rabbit Seasoning, that one cartoon, or Looney Tunes in general, are beautifully drawn, beautifully animated, extremely witty, and the underscoring, not the kill the wabbit, the underscoring is thick, precise, and beautiful. I remember as a kid asking my father, what is that song they always play underneath when somebody eats? And he would say, oh, that's a cup of coffee, a sandwich, and you. And then digging up the song and finding out that it's very good. They're really good. And to just think, oh, it's Bugs Bunny. No, frankly, all of it is much better on all levels than How I Met Your Mother or various comic strips. I think you really do forget them. No. 2 pieces ago, I wrote about Crazy Cat. And you think of Crazy Cat as just some shit because it's spelled with K's. Crazy Cat was, frankly, genius work. It's this mouse throwing a brick at a non-binary cat. Ignatz the mouse. And Ignatz is married. The brick is a token of love. And when Crazy gets hit with the brick, she's clearly having a certain kind of experience, and he's Crazy is non-binary. There's an officer bulldog who's in love with none of it makes any sense, and that to me is the sort of thing that should be brought up in columns and then television, and even bad television. We talked about Dennis the Menace before this. That was frankly a terrible show, but I always enjoyed it because all of the actors except the Mr. Wilson guy looked exactly like the people in the strip. I enjoyed that. So that's the sort of thing that I would probably put in a column.
Have you gone through a Nancy phase yet? If you haven't,
do you know there's a hip Nancy thing?
Yeah.
The kids are reading Nancy.
Ernie Bushmiller is a surrealist. Every day and In Color on
That
Sundays.
was the weirdest. That was the weirdest strip. Yeah. Attention must be paid to things like Nancy and Sluggo. Yeah.
All right, we're going to end it there. John McWhorter, the
On
new
Nancy.
book, or the future book, Pronoun Trouble, The Story of Us in 7 Little Wings.